Let's start back here on dear old planet Earth. Let's go back in time to the early 1960s. Maybe a few of your audience were around at that time. I certainly was. I was driving a Land Rover to India, as it happened, in the early 1960s. I spent a year in Calcutta teaching. Came back to the UK for my 21st birthday and stayed here ever since. I've been trying to get out. I have been back to India. I've been to Japan and South Africa, so I've been around. But I've never been to North America, which is a big problem because a great deal of research and information specifically about the Apollo program is something I'd like to see on the ground, to see in real life. I'm sure there's a great deal I could learn because I'm going to make a statement now, and if anybody can prove me wrong, I would like them to do so. The statement is very simple. No human has ever walked on the lunar surface. That's where we're starting from. Now, how can I support that sort of antagonistic statement? Because those of us who were around at the time, and I was certainly one of them, and I'm sure a lot of your audience were, watched those famous landings on the moon on July the 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climbed down from the lunar module, the Eagle, walked onto the lunar surface. Armstrong made his famous statement,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
And we all believed him because we all saw it. We saw it live on television. This was live, don't forget. This wasn't recorded. This was live transmission from the lunar surface. And that's the first problem. How on earth did they do a live transmission from the lunar surface? Any electrical engineer can tell you quite easily how much power is required to transmit a signal, a radio signal, a TV signal here on Earth. And it's about 30,000 kilowatts. They didn't have 30,000 kilowatts. They had 3,000 watts. 3 kilowatts was available for the power. So that's the first problem. How on earth did they do that live transmission? Now, we all watched that and everybody saw the same thing. So we all reckoned that it's part of our memories. Our memories say, yes, we watched that landing live on the moon, and we watched them come back, and 3 days later, July the 24th, they landed back in the Pacific on the end of their big parachutes, the red and white parachutes, and they were heroes, and they went around the world and met presidents and kings and prime ministers and popes and heads of this and heads of that. Of course it had to be real. You can't fake something like that. No, that was very real. All that was very real. And some of you may remember the famous discovery in the Rijksmuseum of the fake moon rock, which was alleged to have been presented to the then Prime Minister of Holland by Armstrong and Aldrin to commemorate their visit to Amsterdam in 1969. Unfortunately, they couldn't have presented any moon rock to anybody at that time. It was all still held in quarantine at Houston. So the whole story was a wonderful piece of fiction, because it turned out to be a piece of petrified wood. Very strange, that. Things like that crop up. These stories sort of come up over the years. That happened about 10 years ago.
I just want to stop you there for a second.
Yeah.
Why did you take such an interest in this? I mean, you watched it as a kid, you believed it. What 10 years ago, what lecture did you hear 10 years ago that changed your entire vision of what happened?
It was actually about 25 years ago. And one of them is a series of lectures which has been going on now for nearly 30 years. It's called the Glastonbury Symposium, normally held at the end of July. They were talking about megaliths, ancient structures. And the person giving the lecture was talking about all these weird and wonderful structures. And he was talking about the photographs, showing a lot of photographs. And almost as an aside, he said, well, of course, you've probably seen those photographs taken on the moon. Well, they weren't taken on the moon and couldn't have been taken on the moon. Now, he didn't expand any more than that, but it piqued my interest because I had studied photography. Following my trip out to India, I'd taken a lot of photographs out there. I wanted to find out more about the technical side of photography. So I went to college for a couple of years in London to study photography, specifically the technical side of it, not what photographs to take. No, I'm talking about photographic film here. A lot of people won't even seen a photographic film. But in the 1960s and 1970s, photographic film was what was used to record images. Nowadays we use digital. But in the 1960s, they hadn't been invented. So everybody had to use photographic film. Now, photographic film is a strip of plastic-backed gelatin, which is light sensitive and records images by the amount of light that comes into the camera. You develop the film, and if you're using black and white, you develop it into a negative, and you then print that into a positive image to get the image that you'll then look at. So I wanted to know how to go about ensuring that I could use photographic film effectively. I worked professionally in studios in London during the 60s. It was a fascinating time. So this point about the photographs on the moon couldn't have been taken there, I thought, well, that's interesting, because I'd watched the landings live on my little black and white television in London, July the 20th, 1969, 3:30 in the morning it was. A lot of people will remember having watched that. So I was convinced at the time that what I was watching was for real. So when somebody questioned it, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll check these photographs out. I had to go out and buy a set of postcards, because in the early 1990s, there wasn't such a thing as the internet, so I had to get books or magazines and look at the photographs there. I started looking at them, and if you study photography, you'll know how light affects a subject. And you can start to back-engineer a photograph. You can work out where the light was placed, how much light was there. If you know anything about photographic film, you know some of it is very sensitive to light, some of it is less sensitive, but it can record incredible detail. So I looked at the famous photographs of Buzz Aldrin climbing down the ladder from the Eagle, the lunar module, and I started saying, well, okay, I can see what this person might be referring to, because Buzz Aldrin is lit up like a Christmas tree in these photographs. And then you realize that he's actually climbing down in the shadow of the lunar lander, because the sun is the other side of the lander. Therefore, it's all in shadow. But he isn't. He's beautifully illuminated. It's a very good photograph. It shows you everything you want to see. And you can see all the detail in his spacesuit and his soles of his feet. And the more I looked at it, I thought, hang on a minute, there's something going on here, because I knew at that time that no auxiliary lighting had been taken on the Apollo missions. They were saving as much weight as they could. So what's the explanation for it? Oh, it's the sunlight being reflected off the super reflective surface of the moon. Well, on the face of it, that makes sense, until you start looking at it. Well, how much does the lunar surface reflect? And the answer is actually 8% of the light hitting it is reflected. So would 8% of the light hitting the lunar surface be enough to illuminate an astronaut wearing a white spacesuit and being recorded on photographic film, in this case Kodak Ektachrome transparency material? I knew from my own experience using Hasselblad cameras, which is what was being used, using Kodak Ektachrome film, how very sensitive it is to exposure. You have to get the exposure right or you ruin the shot. It's either too bright or it's too dark. I looked more at the photograph, and the directly illuminated surface of the moon, behind the spacecraft in this case, was not overexposed. But Aldrin was beautifully illuminated. And I thought, hang on a minute, there's a problem here. This photograph couldn't have been taken on the lunar surface. And I started looking at other ones, not just Apollo 11, but all the way through the other 6 missions that landed. And the more I looked at them, the more I realized that, yes, there were major problems with some of these photographs. They appear to show what I've subsequently discovered is actually a model. It's not on the lunar surface. Because film, as anybody who's used it will know, is sensitive to light. That's the whole point of film. It's sensitive to light. You have to get the exposure correct to ensure that you get the picture that you want. So all this light on the moon will be quite bright. There's no cloud or atmosphere to dissipate it. So it's quite bright. So how did they get the exposures correct all the time? Because they did. I've looked at virtually all the photographs. There are actually 5,771 photographs taken on the lunar surface by the 12 named astronauts, which is not a significantly large number of photographs, because it's quite easy to take photographs quite rapidly if you want to. Though the Hasselblad cameras were not automatic cameras. They were manually operated cameras, which is another thing. Once I discovered about that, I realized that no, we've got a major problem here, because these Hasselblad cameras, they're extremely good cameras, there's no doubt about that, but they are not automatic cameras. They're not point and shoot camera. That's what we use today. Switch it on, point it and shoot, and you get a good, well-exposed image because the camera does all the work for you. On the moon, using the Hasselblad camera, you had to manually set the focus, you had to manually set the aperture setting, the f8, f11, f16, you had to manually set the shutter speed, 1/60th, 1/25th, 1/250th, And you didn't have a viewfinder, because if you're wearing a spacesuit, you can't get your head down low enough to look through the viewfinder, which on a Hasselblad is on the top of the camera. And you're wearing armored gauntlets in your spacesuit, armored against micrometeorite impact. So with all these limitations of use, some of the most defining images of the 20th century were taken. They weren't taken on the moon, they were taken here on Earth under controlled studio conditions by professional photographers. And if anybody can prove me wrong on that, I'd like to know. Because in 25 years of researching the subject, I've yet to have anybody give me any convincing case, or even any case at all, to say that they were taken on the lunar surface. Because there are two major problems when you're taking photographs on the moon. One of them is the radiation. It's not just radiation in the Valon radiation belts which surround the Earth. They follow the lines of the magnetic field of the Earth, and they protect us from the radiation of space, as does our atmosphere. Once you're beyond the Van Allen belts, about 20,000 miles out, you're in what Neil Armstrong referred to as cislunar space, basically the area of space between the Earth and the Moon, which is the same as the space that surrounds the solar system. In that space, you've got solar particle events, solar flares, radiation from the sun, and you've got galactic cosmic rays coming from deep space, all of which affect photographic film. And you can't protect the camera from the radiation of space. You might be able to protect it from the temperature, which is quite severe in space. It's well over 100 degrees centigrade, higher than the boiling point of water, if you're standing in the sun. There's an even bigger problem in space. It's the vacuum of space. We don't have a vacuum here on Earth unless we create it. We're standing on Earth and we have 14.7 pounds per square inch of atmospheric pressure above our heads, which is 8 tons per square meter, which is quite a lot. We don't notice it because it's coming from all sides, so the only way we affect it, if we start driving our car too fast and stick our hand out the window and you'll get the hand blown black, because the atmosphere is quite dense. In space, there is no atmosphere. There's nothing. It's a vacuum. And a vacuum has severe effects on photographic film. It has severe effects on a lot of things, but we're just talking about photographic film. If you have ever done those experiments at school with a vacuum chamber, and you put a bowl of water in the vacuum chamber and you've created the vacuum, you'll notice the water starts to boil. Another word for that would be called outgassing. Any liquid will be boiled in a vacuum. And the other thing that happens in a vacuum, which is not really very well understood because we don't experience it very often here down on Earth, is called cold welding. Cold welding is, as its name implies, where you get two metals coming together and they will, in a vacuum, literally weld themselves together. It's caused by the outgassing of the lighter elements within whatever metal you've got, aluminium, magnesium, titanium. All of them outgas particles, and those intermingle if they're close to another piece of metal, right, and they in effect weld together. But there was no evidence of cold welding of these Hasselblad cameras, let alone the spacesuits. So we've got this major problem of the vacuum of space. We've got another huge problem of the radiation in space. But the photographs that we see taken on the lunar surface have no radiation damage to them at all. If you remember a few years ago when you went through airport security, they were using X-ray machines. You were always advised, if you had photographic film, to have them hand searched and not put through the machine, otherwise it would damage the film. And you would normally protect them in a lead-lined box. So where are the lead-lined boxes on the moon? No, there weren't any. So there was no protection from the radiation of space on the photographic film. And there was certainly no protection from the vacuum of space, which would destroy film. As I say, some of the most defining images of the 20th century were produced. Yes, they were produced here on Earth, not on the moon.
But nobody ever has come out publicly and stated that they were part of this photographic moon hoax.
No, they haven't. You're quite right. And there's a very good reason for that, because there were 400,000 people working on the Apollo program at the height of it in 1966. And they were people working right across America, from Seattle, where Boeing were making part of the Saturn V and the Lunar rover, down to Lockheed and Martin and over in Connecticut, where they were making the spacesuits, down at Houston, where they had the control center. All these people were working towards one aim, and they only knew about the job they were employed to do. The people working in Seattle didn't know about spacesuits. It wasn't their job to know about it. It's called compartmentalization. It's a military term where you know enough to do your own job. That's all you need to know. We all watched the same thing. We all watched the same piece of film of the rockets taking off. Those were real. But where they went 2 minutes after they launched, we had to rely on NASA to tell us what happened next. And for the next, in case Apollo 11, the next 8 days. Well, if we don't believe that everything that NASA tells you is true, because it stands for never a straight answer or no astronaut sent anywhere, then you have to start researching it yourself and looking into the detailed paperwork and the work that was done by the people working on it to find out if it all adds up. And in my opinion, it does not add up. That does not mean that these people were lying. They were not. They did not know anything about this. They only knew what they were doing themselves, because they couldn't get there for a start. Where's the evidence that they did land on the moon? Now, I've seen 80-foot gorillas climb the Empire State Building. I've seen dinosaurs chasing kids around kitchens in Jurassic Park. Is that real? Of course it's not. It's Hollywood at its finest. And Apollo is Hollywood at its finest. I'm not saying Hollywood was involved, because I can't prove it. But the film that we see, the Apollo record, and there's hundreds of hours of film, which you can go onto any number of websites and check out, has been deconstructed. And if anybody is interested in finding out the truth about how the Apollo hoax was perpetrated, or the film's part of it, there's a very good and very interesting and highly technical film called Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors. It's 2 hours 44 minutes long. When it was originally released about 5 years ago, the narrator of that film was so concerned that he didn't want to be identified that he disguised and distorted his voice to the extent you couldn't hear what he's saying. It's now been redubbed with a proper voiceover, and it's now available on a website, actually in Canada, called Apollo Detectives. So go on there, have a look at it, and see what you think. You'll see a few of my discussions with various people about it as well. Apollo Detectives on YouTube. The film Make Believe Smoke and Mirrors, it's a highly technical film, and it looks at how all the effects were created, the apparent slow motion. It's not just filmed and then slowed down so it all appears slow motion. No, it's far more complex than that. It's different speeds at different distances. It's the use of models and mannequins to create the environment. It's a stage set, in effect. It's quite a big stage set, but it's a stage set nevertheless. It was filmed here on Earth under controlled conditions, because it couldn't be filmed on the moon, because we've already covered the radiation problem affecting photographic film, and all Apollo missions were filmed. They weren't all video, and the photographs, the still photographs taken by Hasselblad cameras, they were all films. And it's important to get the distinction between a film and a digital camera. Digital cameras didn't exist at the time of Apollo. How do we know that this is the case? How do we know that vacuum affects photographic film? Because that's hardly been mentioned as a problem. In fact, it's only in the last couple of years that it's actually come to be discussed at all, the effect of vacuum on photographic film. And that was a result of a lecture I attended here in London about 2 years ago, where the designer of the film cameras carried on the Hexagon spy satellite explained the details of his work. He was very proud of what he'd done. He designed and built the stereo cameras that were carried on the Hexagon reconnaissance satellite, let's call it, launched in 1971. And he mentioned, almost in passing, well, of course, the whole film had to be held in a pressurized container in the spacecraft, in the Hexagon spy satellite. Actually, it then asked the question, why was it pressurized? He said, very simple. Photographic film cannot work unless it is under a degree of pressure, in this case 1 pound per square inch. Not a great deal of pressure, the equivalent of flying at about 60,000 feet above Earth. That's 1 pound per square inch. At the top of Mount Everest, it's 5 pound per square inch. That's the pressure beyond which humans can't survive, because the pressure is not sufficient to force the oxygen into the lungs against the back pressure of 14.7 pounds per square inch, which is the normal pressure inside the human body. So I asked him, I said, well, would pressurization be required to achieve the photographs we see on Apollo? He said, yes, of course they would. You can't use photographic film outside a pressurized environment. Now, the only other spacecraft that I was aware of at the time that used photographic film on the moon was the Lunar Orbiter craft, flying in 1966-67 to photograph potential landing sites for Apollo. And it carried photographic film on board. The film was contained within a pressurized environment on the spacecraft. It's no secret. Once you find the schematics of the Lunar Orbiter and the hexagon, you'll see it's identified. Pressurized container. It's nitrogen gas they used to keep the pressure. On the Lunar Orbiter, they did use photographic film, and it was developed on board the spacecraft by a type of Polaroid system which used liquids which have to be pressurized, otherwise they outgas and boil and don't work. The film was then scanned, and the scanned image was transmitted back to Earth, where it was reassembled back to make the photographs. And I've seen several of the Lunar Orbiter photographs. They're quite good. They got very high definition, and these are film. They're not digital, and those were the two craft that had used photographic film in space, and both of them had to have pressurization to ensure the film maintained its integrity. So if that's the case, these photographs of astronauts walking around on the lunar surface doing all sorts of things were taken with photographic film, but they weren't taken on the moon. They couldn't have been. The photographic film would not have worked. The cameras were not pressurized. Now, whether man landed on the moon is another question, which maybe we can come to later. But so far as the photographs are concerned, no, they weren't taken on the moon.
I want to ask you this, sir, if you don't mind, and that is in regards to the technology that it took to get there. All right. I mean, it has been blown up over the last number of years that what we carry on our cell phone on a daily basis has more computers, more technology, more memory, more everything than the entire Apollo program had when they put their rockets into space. But one thing I have noticed with a lot of people who are my age and younger, the one thing that we do is we try and put yesterday's understanding of technology and mix it with today's technology with what we know. And we cannot comprehend the difference of how men and women made things work back then comparatively to how they make things work now. There's a giant confusion about that I believe is out there. What is your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent point, because that more or less sums up the problems that we have. Everybody wants to believe Apollo happened, but you do have to go back to the time it happened, mid to late 1960s, early 1970s, and look at the technology that was available to design the rockets, to design all the space suits, the control centers, the lunar rovers, all the technology that was used to allegedly get man to the moon. They actually used slide rules. In skilled hands, they're very, very good pieces of equipment. They're basically a form of calculator, but they are linear. So slide rules to me are a pretty ancient technology, but that was what was used to design the spacecraft. Slide rules. They didn't use computers. Forget computer-aided design. Forget it. Didn't exist. This is the 1960s. Things were very different. And as you say, it's very hard for people to get their head around the fact that cars did not have seat belts or airbags. They were extremely dangerous machines, actually, at the time. Not by just crashing into somebody, but by what was inside the car when you were thrown around during a relatively minor accident. You could get killed by it. Steering wheel was like a 6-inch nail pointing straight at your chest. But the technology that we have today is so far different, so far advanced from what we had just 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that if you're not familiar with it, it's very hard to get your head around the fact that that could have done what we are told it did. And I say that a great deal of it couldn't have happened, mainly because the technology was so primitive at the time. It was a miracle that even that 360-foot high Saturn V rocket, by the way, it's called a Saturn V rocket because it had 5 engines, took off, and 1 million people watched Apollo 11 take off, disappear from sight. So then what happened? And how do we know what happened? We know what happened because NASA tell us. They were the only people who had access to the communication. And we're suddenly being told that we could communicate from the moon to Earth with these astronauts driving around, on the case of Apollo 15, 16, 17, driving around in the lunar rover. And It appears the technology is advanced, and many people can understand advanced technology, but they can't understand primitive technology. And this is actually primitive technology. The computers on board the Apollo command module, known as the AGC, the Apollo Guidance Computer, was a very, very primitive, by today's standards, piece of equipment. It could do certain things. It couldn't record anything. It didn't have the ability to record any information. The astronauts had to punch into it commands, which would then give an answer, but it couldn't then do anything. So the question arises, how on earth did they navigate? How did they get from the Earth to the Moon? Well, you can see the Moon, so you know where you're going, but there's a long distance between the Earth and the Moon, 240,000 miles. How do you navigate across that distance? Now, any pilot, anybody who's flown an aircraft, will know that piloting and following a particular path with an aircraft is actually quite complicated. You have to have radio beacons. In the old days of aircraft, you just followed rivers and roads, and you just hoped it was the right river and the right road, and you get to where you wanted to get to. Today, you use radio beacons, and you tune into radio beacon, and you can navigate across considerable distances, even across oceans. But the Apollo craft were navigating across a vast amount of space which had no features, so you didn't know where you were going. But we're told the computer did. No, the computer didn't. They were using a sextant. This is a 17th century device for taking star sightings if you're navigating across an ocean on a ship, to line up on certain stars. Obviously they know where the star is, and in relation to where you are, the star will tell you if you're on course or not. But it's very hard to change direction in space. You have to use a propulsion. And then we come on to Apollo 13. Oh dear. Oh, what a problem Apollo 13 is. Can we tell you the story of Apollo 13?
Let's get into it. We're already this deep into the pool. We need to do this now.
I think Apollo 13 is necessary because it's the outlier of the Apollo missions. There were 9 Apollo missions were sent to orbit the moon. Apollo 8 was the first one, totally untested. There'd be no test of the heat shield when it returned. Then you had Apollo 9, which was Earth orbit. Then you had Apollo 10, which was another orbit of the moon. Didn't land. Apollo 11 allegedly landed. Apollo 12 allegedly landed. And Apollo 13 didn't. Apollo 13 had an accident on the way. An oxygen tank exploded, we're told. That would have sent the craft so far off course, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If an oxygen tank exploded, it would be like firing a rocket. It would send it off in a different direction. But no, they didn't have a problem knowing where they were. They orbited around the back of the moon and landed back on Earth 8 days later, we're told. What we're not often told is the day after the official launch of Apollo 13, which was witnessed by many thousands of people, so it was for real. The day after Apollo 13 was officially launched, on April the 12th, in the Bay of Biscay, which is off the coast of France and Spain, the Soviet Navy recovered an Apollo command capsule from the Atlantic Ocean. They took it back with them to Murmansk, where the Atlantic Fleet is based, and 6 months later they handed it over to America on the US Coast Guard cutter, the South Wind, which was visiting Murmansk. What on earth was an Apollo command module doing floating in the Atlantic, being recovered by the Soviet Navy? It hadn't been reported missing. The official story is that it was what's called a boilerplate capsule, i.e. a practice capsule, not one that would go into space. I mean, this is for real. There are photographs of it being recovered from the Atlantic Ocean, being taken to Murmansk, being handed over to the South Wind, and you can go and see it now if you go to Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's on display outside their museum there. The official Apollo 13 command module, the one allegedly that had the accident and returned and all the astronauts survived and we all cheered and thought it was wonderful, is on display at the Kansas Cosmodrome. But you can't actually see inside it. You can't actually see very much. And the one at Grand Rapids, the alleged boilerplate, is sealed until the year 2076, the 300th anniversary of the founding of America. What's going on? Now, this was reported in the US military publication, The Stars and Stripes. It was also reported extensively in the Soviet Union, because they were quite proud of having recovered this thing. Now, if it was a practice capsule, let's say, and it had fallen off the side of a ship, oh dear, it's drifting away, somebody will pick it up, somebody might have said. It's a long way from Florida to the Bay of Biscay. How long would it take to drift there? 5-6 weeks, maybe? If it had drifted there would be barnacles and seaweed and all the stuff that you get when a ship is in the sea for too long. But there was none of that visible on it. It's as if it had just fallen off the side of a ship and been picked up the next day, or came down from space. I'm not saying it's the official Apollo 13 command module, because I don't know, but I do think it is particularly weird that this command module, be it a boilerplate or a real capsule, which you can't see inside now because it's sealed, was recovered by the Soviet Navy. And they handed it back, because that's what you're supposed to do. If you find any nation's space artifacts, you hand it back to the nation that originated it. And that's what the Soviet Navy did. But it's very, very strange story, and the coincidences start to add up. Found the day after the official launch of Apollo 13 was way off course if it was for real. Because normally when you launch a rocket from Cape Canaveral, it will fly out over Africa. And the first thing you'll look out for what's called the Eye of Africa. It's a very visible physical feature in Mauritania. It's about 20 kilometers in diameter. It's 3 concentric circles, hence the eye. Astronauts flying out would look out for it and say, at least we got to Africa, guys. Let's go on a bit. We'll get to India next and maybe South America. Then we'll go on round. But Mauritania is about 1,500 miles south of the Bay of Biscay, deserts of Mauritania. NASA will not even address the issue. Right. And NASA have a habit of refusing to acknowledge it.
Let me ask you this right off the bat, if you don't mind. Do you believe we have put men and women into space?
Oh, yes, definitely. Men and women have been into space since Yuri Gagarin allegedly flew the first orbit of the Earth in April 1961, which was followed 6 weeks later by John Kennedy in his address to the Joint Houses of Congress. We will land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. At that point, no American had been into orbit. John Glenn was the first American to orbit, and that was a year later. John Kennedy didn't know if it was possible to do it, but he was doing this as a political response to the considerable surprise that the Soviet Union had orbited Yuri Gagarin 6 weeks earlier. He had to be seen to do something about it. Now, don't forget, John Kennedy had only been in office since January of that year, 1961. He was inaugurated in January. He'd already had to deal with the Bay of Pigs fiasco, so his presidency got off to a bit of a shaky start. So he decided that he would put forward this idea of landing a man on the moon. It's just something which would gee up the American public after the ridiculous performance in Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. Going to the moon was quite an undertaking, and this is the problem. So this is my challenge to your audience. If you can prove that humans have landed on the lunar surface and returned safely to Earth, I would love to hear it. Because going to the moon, there are 3 major problems which have to be overcome. You have to have a rocket to do it, the Saturn V rocket. We have to get through the radiation problem, which NASA still admit today is a problem. The Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation as it is now, acknowledge that it is a problem. They've said so. And then the biggest problem of all is getting back, the re-entry through the Earth's atmosphere. At the same speed you leave Earth at, which is 25,000 miles an hour, i.e. very fast, you have to slow down and you use the atmospheric friction to remove the kinetic energy of the spacecraft and convert it into heat. So you need a heat shield to protect your capsule in which the astronauts are before the parachutes can open and they can drop into in this case, the Pacific Ocean. But how did that heat shield work under the conditions that we're told it did? Because the Apollo command modules returned on what's called a direct entry. i.e. they came straight in, whack, hit the atmosphere, slow down, parachutes open, splash, pick up, big heroes. That's how we're told it happened. The Soviets have never used direct entry. They use what's called skip entry, where they come in, bounce off the atmosphere to remove some of the speed, and then, having slowed down a bit, they can come in under a more controlled manner. And if you look at any spacecraft that returns from the space station, they're the only ones we can see nowadays, they don't come in at nearly the same speed, 17,500 miles an hour. That's the orbit speed of the ISS. So the returning capsules have to slow down, and they use heat shields on it, and the heat generated is much lower. It's a much less amount of heat at 17,500 miles an hour than at 25,000 miles an hour. And if you look at any of the Soyuz command capsules returning from the ISS, they're basically black from the heat generated and the soot created by the ablative material, which is a type of resin which destroys itself and protects the craft inside it. Now, there's something that you may have heard a little bit about. It's called the Orion capsule. This is Apollo 2.0, and it's going to be launched on whatever rocket they decide to put it on, the SLS, the Space Launch System, which is the only surviving part of the Constellation program, which was cancelled by Obama in 2010. The Space Launch System was retained by Congress because they had mandated that NASA should use an American rocket, because the only way they could get to the space station for a long time was using Russian rockets. And the only way they could launch very much into space was using Russian rocket engines, the RD-180s, very, very successful engine. So what you've got here is a reliance on the Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation now, to reach the ISS. We've only just seen SpaceX take their Dragon capsule with 2 astronauts on board up to the space station successfully, which was a good thing to have seen. But when you've got this problem of returning from lunar orbit, which is not the same thing at all as returning from the space station, it's returning at 50% increase in speed, which if you use the inverse square law, you've got to have twice the protection. When the Orion capsule was tested in December 2014, i.e. 6 years ago, and don't forget Apollo only took 7.5 years from a standing start to landing on the moon, the Orion capsule, or the heat shield, almost failed. So why didn't they just use what was successful on Apollo? Oh, they lost the formula. Oh, goodness, like they've lost the plans. They've lost so much of Apollo. They lost all the original films and the biometric data. Very careless, that. It's a ridiculous idea that they lost it. It probably never existed in the first place, which is why they can't find it. A great deal of the biometric data was allegedly found in a disused McDonald's restaurant somewhere in Louisiana, I think it was. They're not very careful about looking after their technology. So one has to question whether the technology exists. So that was my original challenge.
Here's part of my argument with that. In the late 1950s, the United States government was developing the SR-71, which could fly at Mach 3.3. That full number was never ever disclosed. It is still top secret to this day, which means that it was close to hypersonic speed. If not, could be hypersonic. We don't know. All right, so if we had the technology in 61 to fly an aircraft and create an aircraft of that magnitude and that speed at that altitude, which was well over 80,000, 90,000 feet, why couldn't we turn that technology into rocket technology to boost ourselves into space and to make the run at the moon?
That's a very logical conclusion to reach. But the SR-71 used a ramjet engine. It didn't use a rocket, basically a jet engine. I'm not sure it flew as high as 80,000 feet. It certainly flew very high, because that was its main defense against missiles being fired at it. 2,000 missiles were fired at the SR-71 over its 20-year period. None of them hit it, which is obviously a successful mission, but it was an aeroplane. It wasn't a rocket. Yes, the technology had been developed, and it was an extremely advanced aircraft. It's probably the most beautiful aircraft ever designed. It was a fantastic machine. It could do incredible things. Ironically, one of the reports from the SR-71 ties in with the duplicity of NASA. So they were flying over Vietnam in the early 1970s. They had to be refueled twice coming back over the Pacific to America. And one of the pilots said he wanted to just have a chance to look out at the canopy of stars above him. Now, flying at 70,000, 80,000 feet, the stars would be brilliant. So he switched off his cabin lights just for a few seconds. And once his eyes had adapted to the dark, he said the starlight above was so bright it could illuminate my flight controls, which rather puts a different aspect to the story that you couldn't see stars in space. Of course you could see stars in space. They're all over the place. They're huge. There's a vast amount of stars. And when you're in space, there's no atmosphere to diffuse them. You can see anything. And the other point about space travel, proving Apollo's falsity, was some of the first space shuttles were flown. The first one was Columbia in 1981. Once the space shuttles had got their act together a bit, because it took 10 years to develop the space shuttle from the end of the Apollo era, you'd think they'd just stick the thing on top of a Saturn V rocket, but no, they had to develop a whole new propulsion system. Well, why? Why not just use what was successful with Apollo? It could lift more than the shuttle launch system. The huge red fuel tank with the two external solid fuel boosters did not have the same power as the Saturn V rocket. Anyway, once they got the shuttle up there, astronauts had to work outside when they were launching satellites or they were doing work outside. The astronauts would complain every time the shuttle flew into the shadow of the Earth and it spent half its time in the shadow of the Earth, i.e. no heat. They complained that their hands got cold, so cold they couldn't work. And NASA said, "Oh, so stupid, of course you can work, just get on with it." They said, no, seriously, this is very cold up here. Because in the shadow of the Earth, there's no heat, there's no radiant energy of the sun, and for half the orbit, they're in the shadow of the Earth. So NASA said, okay, take some temperature readings, and let's just see how they vary. You'd think they'd have worked out by then, by the time the shuttle was flying in the 1980s, what the temperature of space was, but no, they had to do it all over again. So they took temperature readings up there, and the report said that within a few minutes, having come out of the shadow of the Earth, entering the sun, the temperature increased by over 100 degrees centigrade within a few minutes. So they were able to prove that they needed electric heaters in their gloves, which is what they got. The point about that is that if you're standing in sunlight on the lunar surface, you're in the direct energy of the sun all the time, because there's no shade on the moon, you will be in extremely high temperature. So how do they keep cool? Because humans cannot work in much over about 20-25 degrees centigrade.
You've never lived in northern Canada then, my friend.
Could you work in minus 40 degrees? Yes, you can, because people do work in that temperature. They are prepared for it. Let's just say that if you had to wear a spacesuit in northern Canada, where the temperature falls, is minus 40 centigrade fair?
I'll go outside and snow blow my driveway at minus 25.
But they are prepared for it. What I was referring to here was the heat, not the cold. And we can come on to the cold in a minute. But the heat on the moon will be plus 100, 120 degrees centigrade. That is severely above what you would be comfortable working in. Humans can't work in much over about 25 degrees centigrade, 70, 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So how did they keep cool? Because the longest EVA, extravehicular activity, moonwalk, was just under 8 hours straight, no stops. That was on Apollo 17. They were outside in direct sunlight for 8 hours. And this sunlight is the radiant energy of the sun. It's like standing in front of a fire. If you've got logs burning in a fire, you can feel the heat coming off them. That's the radiant energy of the logs. And you can't stand in front of that for very long if it's a big fire. On the moon, there's a big fire in the sky. It's called the sun. And that is producing this radiant energy. Astronauts would have to remove some of that energy. It would have to be removed from inside their spacesuit, because they're also generating heat themselves by moving around, by doing work. It's a standard procedure. So how did they remove this energy? Because a vacuum, which is what we got on the moon, is the best insulator of them all. Like air conditioning dumps heat from inside a room to outside a room. You can't do that on the moon because you can't dump the heat anywhere. The only way you can get rid of the heat is by radiating it away, or the explosive decompression of water. So you can carry water with you and you expel that and it will remove heat, but you can't carry enough water. You can calculate how much water is required to remove a certain amount of heat in a certain period of time. And the amount of water that the astronauts carried was about 3 litres. They would need about 30 litres to remove the amount of heat that we're told will be generated by the sun. So something doesn't add up here. So you've got all these anomalies in the record. It's a great story. And I claim that Apollo, it's a story to persuade us that humans have walked on the moon. Now that was 50 years ago. 12 astronauts allegedly walked on the lunar surface and they haven't been back. Oh, there wasn't enough money. Oh, there's no interest in doing it. Oh, they're just getting around to doing it now, aren't they? President Trump has decreed that humans must be returned to the moon by 2024. That's 5 years he gave them to do it. You think it'd be simple enough? Dig out the old plans of how we did it back then and just do it in 21st century technology. Simple, no problem. What's the hold-up? There's huge hold-ups. They haven't got a rocket yet that's been tested. They haven't got a spacecraft with a re-entry testing being done. They haven't got the spacesuits being made. You have to make some for the women. It's called the Artemis program, the new return to the moon. Artemis was Apollo's twin sister, so it's reasonable to assume that women are going to be involved somewhere. But none of that has happened yet. It's not simple. Space travel is extremely difficult. And back in the 60s, space travel was cutting edge. It was the high tech of its day. And though it may seem very easy from our viewpoint of the 21st century, from 2020, looking back 50 years, we say, well, they did it successfully back then. They had pretty primitive technology, but they appear to have done it. No, they didn't. It was a brilliantly executed propaganda exercise. So why didn't the Russians blow the whistle? Why didn't the Russians come out and say, oh, didn't happen, couldn't have happened? Okay, that's a reasonable point to make. Who in Russia would have blown the whistle back in the 1960s, 1970s? The head of the Soviet Politburo was Leonid Brezhnev at the time. Who would have had the access to him and have the technical knowledge to know that what we were being shown by the US Apollo program was a fake? Who would have had the knowledge to do it? Why did nobody in the West blow the whistle? Why did no photographers? Why did no engineers? Why did no biologists? Why did no anthropologists? Why did no ologists? Why did none of them come forward and say, it's fake? They did come forward and say it's fake. But nobody wanted to believe them. Nobody wanted to listen to it. Nobody wanted to hear that the emperor has no clothes. They didn't want to believe it, so they didn't. So they went along with the fantasy of landing a man on the moon. But now it's being exposed, because if you can't do it with 21st century technology, it certainly didn't happen with 1960s technology. And we've got a real problem here, because how is NASA going to explain this one away? I'd love to hear it. I'd love to see it. Because if I'm wrong, I want to know. But there's a saying that Carl Sagan, who was a brilliant science populist, said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Landing a man on the moon is an extraordinary claim. Where is the extraordinary evidence in support of it? I don't know. I haven't seen it.
All right, I got to ask you this. What would the purpose of NASA have for covering up the entire story of Apollo?
Good point. You have to take yourself back to the late 1960s. What was happening in America, what was happening in the world? The Vietnam War was starting. Well, it started in 1964 by one of those famous false flag events, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And for 10 years after 1964, until America rather ignominiously pulled themselves out of Vietnam, 58,000 American soldiers were killed, 3 million Vietnamese were killed. That is the price you pay for crass incompetence. So the Vietnam War was getting very unpleasant. The Cold War was ramping up, the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union. Who had the best political system? Who had the biggest bomb? Who could destroy the most people? Who could influence the most nations? That was all going on. There were also riots going on inside America, the Democrat convention in Chicago, where protesters were actually being shot dead by the National Guard. That's how unpleasant it was becoming. So America had to be seen to be succeeding, and Apollo was the success story. Apollo had to be the success story, because everything else was failure and disaster. So Apollo had to be seen to be successful. Whether it happened or not was basically irrelevant. It had to be seen to be successful. And the best way to do that is using what America is quite good at, which is creating visual images to support their political proposals. They have access to Hollywood. They have access to a great deal of technical knowledge within the film business. I'm not saying that Hollywood was directly involved. And before anybody here starts saying, oh, it's all Kubrick. No, it wasn't Kubrick. He was such a perfectionist. He always wanted to shoot on location if he could. But he couldn't in this case. And Kubrick wasn't involved. He was busy doing his masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was released in 1968. There were other films coming out as well. There were a lot of people who were very good at special effects on film. Now, just north of Los Angeles, in a place called Laurel Canyon, it's where a lot of musicians lived in the early 1960s, who incidentally had a lot of connections with the intelligence services. One of the most famous was Jim Morrison, whose father was Admiral George Morrison, who actually was the American naval commander at the Gulf of Tonkin. So there are interesting connections there. But in Laurel Canyon, there was a U.S. Air Force facility called Lookout Mountain Laboratory, which was a very well-equipped film production facility, basically post-production. Lookout Mountain Laboratories is now a private home. It's owned by Jared Leto, the singer and actor. But up to the late 1960s, it operated as a U.S. Air Force film production facility. There's also, near San Francisco, a place called Menlo Park. And at Menlo Park is one of the largest buildings in North America. It's called Hangar 1. It was built in the 1930s as an airship hangar. It's several hundred foot long. It's vast. You can see it on Google Maps now. Just put Hangar 1 Menlo Park and you'll see it. And this is where I suggest that a lot of the filming of the big sets was done because everything could be controlled. It's where Tom Hanks filmed Apollo 13 and the mini-series From the Earth to the Moon. It was all done at Menlo Park. It's a huge and controllable environment. Now, whether that is what happened or not, I don't know, but it makes much more sense than saying they went to the moon to film it for various reasons, such as the film wouldn't work. The rockets wouldn't get there. The astronauts wouldn't survive. There were plenty of other places around. Another one is Cinder Lake near Flagstaff in Arizona, where a life-size version of the Sea of Tranquility on which the Apollo 11 landing would take place was constructed by the U.S. Geological Survey. It's called Cinder Lake because basically that's what it consists of. It's volcanic cinder, which is similar to the lunar surface. The U.S. Geological Survey took a few sticks of dynamite and created some craters, identical to the craters around which they will be landing on Apollo 11. There is also near to that location a landfill site, which had a huge amount of military equipment just dumped, which would make nice rocks if you could spray them with a bit of shotcrete. And that's what appears to have happened. So a lot of what we see as images taken on the moon were taken in Arizona at Cinder Lake. Some was filmed in Hawaii, some in Iceland. These are all similar physical locations to what we'd expect to find on the moon. So what you've got is a plausible explanation for how it was done, but people don't want to believe it. People say, no, it couldn't possibly have happened. Oh, those 400,000 people who worked for it, they would have blown the whistle. Oh, no, you can't keep a secret. Of course you can keep a secret. The Manhattan Project employed 150,000 people, and the first anybody knew of what they were doing was when the bomb went off over Hiroshima. 1 million people were assembled for the D-Day landings in 1944. The Germans didn't find out what was going on until the landing craft discharged its troops onto the beaches of Normandy. Secrets can be kept. And the reason that secrets can be kept is very simple. It's national security. If you tell people this is in the interests of national security, most people, being patriotic, will say, okay, I agree with that. I won't be discussing it beyond the people I'm allowed to talk to about it. And they will go along with that. All the astronauts were military. A lot of the senior personnel at NASA were military. The US Air Force was brought in to get the whole operation back on track after the disaster of Apollo 1, when some idiot decided to pressurize the cabin containing pure oxygen at 20 pounds per square inch. Guess what's going to happen? It'll explode if there's an electrical fault, which is what appears to have happened. So the US Air Force was brought in. They introduced a lot of their systems, which had worked very well, and people were willing to go along with it because landing a man on the moon, defeating the Soviet Union, was a matter of national importance and national security. They would go along with it. They're not going to question it. They're not going to blow the whistle. There's no whistle to blow. They just do it as best they can, and that's what they were doing, the very best job they could. They knew what they had to achieve, and by and large they achieved it. But could the rocket do what it was supposed to have done? Like I said, there were 5 engines. They produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust each. That's about 600 tons. It's a vast amount of energy. Were the engines up to the job? Could they launch the purported 46 tons into lunar orbit, 130 tons into Earth orbit? That's what we're told the Saturn V rocket did. Since that, no rocket has come anywhere close to achieving that level of power, let alone that amount launched into Earth orbit. The space shuttle couldn't do it. The Space Launch System, the new super-duper wonderful new rocket, can't do it. The BFR, the Big Falcon rocket from SpaceX, can just about do it, which hasn't been tested yet. So all this is going on, so there's a lot of publicity about it. Oh, we are wonderful, we're doing all this stuff now. Well, let's see it happen. And whether Apollo did what we're told it did, I think is very much open to doubt, because nobody has been able to prove it. Nobody has been able to come forward with a convincing explanation. Even the Soviet Union were trying to get to the moon. But there's also another point which is not generally known about. In September 1968, i.e. before Apollo 8 allegedly launched, the first contracts were signed between the Soviet Union, as it was then, and the governments of Germany, Hungary and Austria to supply them with the one major product the Soviet Union had available for export, natural gas. The whole deal is called pipes for gas. West Germany would build the pipes, 2,000 kilometers of 4-foot diameter pipe, and the Soviet Union would supply the gas. This would ensure the survival of the Soviet Union because it had no other means of earning foreign currency. They weren't going to blow the whistle on some Americans prancing around allegedly on the lunar surface if it would jeopardize their national income. That is generally not known about, but it's perfectly easy to check out the details of it. So pipes for gas is one of the names given to it. The natural gas in the Soviet Union comes from Siberia and quite a lot of reserves of oil. And there is now a big row going on about what's called Nord Stream 2, which is one of the main pipelines coming out of St. Petersburg under the Baltic, and it enters on the north coast of Germany. That's where one of the major supply routes come in. In the mid-1960s, the Soviet Union used as a tracking station Jodrell Bank here in the UK. It's near Manchester in central UK. They used the radio telescope at Jodrell Bank to assist in the tracking of Soviet spacecraft, especially the Soviet spacecraft going to the moon. It was quite open about it. It was done with the knowledge of the British government and the American government. And the head of the Jodrell Bank radio telescope at the time was Sir Bernard Lovell. And he was invited to visit the Soviet Union on several occasions in the 1960s. And he was quite open about it. He said, look, when are you guys going to send somebody to the moon? When are you going to send a cosmonaut to the moon? And I said, well, we intend to. We've got a rocket to do it. It's called the N1 rocket. We've got a spacecraft in which they'll travel. But we will not be sending a cosmonaut to the moon until we can ensure their safe return due to the dangers of radiation. So they knew about the problem. It wasn't as if it was a big secret. Now, there's an interesting follow-up on that. Also in September 1968, the Soviet Union launched a Zond 5. It's an unmanned Soviet craft. It was launched to the moon. It would orbit the moon and return to Earth. This would be the very first time any capsule launched from Earth would return intact to Earth. It landed in the Indian Ocean. And on board were 2 turtles, small tortoises, some plants, some seeds, various other biological life, to test what would happen in the radiation. And they landed, and the turtles were okay, probably a bit pissed off, but happy to be back on Earth now. And they were still alive, so obviously there was no problem with radiation, was there? Well, it wasn't a very good test, because cockroaches will be the one animal that will survive a nuclear blast. Turtles can survive thousands of times higher levels of radiation exposure than humans can. So it wasn't a particularly good test. Because if you go to your dentist to have your tooth x-ray, you'll probably have to wear a lead apron, or certainly the operator of the equipment will be wearing a protection against the radiation. Because radiation is cumulative in the human body. It'll kill you if you get too much of it. So you've got this problem with radiation. The Soviet Union knew perfectly well there was a problem with it. They actually announced it. They didn't put 2 and 2 together. They just said, well, radiation's a problem and we won't be going to the moon until we can solve it. Some of the senior personnel at NASA have said exactly the same thing. When we get out beyond the Van Allen belts, we want to ensure that our astronauts are not exposed to a greater level of radiation than they can survive. Well, if radiation is just no worse than a couple of chest x-rays, what's the problem? There's a major problem. It's lethal to humans. And we haven't solved it yet. And we're nowhere near solving it. Once the deception was perpetrated originally, it had to be kept alive. And we've seen it at the 50th anniversary, where you've got all these films of Apollo 11 and First Man and all the other things. There are books about it coming out all the time. There are a lot of people who are put a lot of energy and effort, and their integrity is at stake. They're not about to give up easily. They're not going to throw their hands up and say, oh, sorry guys, we've misled you for the last 50 years. It's not going to happen. Though I would say one thing. President Trump is very well informed about a lot of things which he doesn't talk very much about. He's had to be. That's his business.
You've stirred and ruffled the feathers with a lot of people listening tonight, because history has told us differently. And, one of the things that has always kind of, rubbed me the wrong way about those who say that this is fake is the word proof. Show us proof, photographs, video evidence. It hasn't been anybody who's ever come out saying that I worked on this project to fake these photos or to fake this video. Why do you think that has been so tightly kept?
Partly because there were very, very few people involved in the actual fakery. If we go back to the whole Apollo program from 1961 through to 1972, there was a lot of simulations being done. I mean, that's a normal thing to do. You're going to go to a place you've never been to before, you want to simulate it as closely as you can. Same way that airline pilots are trained on simulators. If you get into one of these simulators, and let's say you're going to land at Heathrow Airport, in my case, you're in one of these simulators, it looks very, very much as if it is Heathrow Airport. You're coming into land, the buildings around you, the sights ahead of you, they'll be exactly what you'd expect to see. This is what simulation is about. Apollo had simulators, similar to those airline simulators we see today. They had simulators for the command module, they had simulators for the lunar landers. And in order to do that, they had to produce film showing what would be outside the window as the astronauts would be trying to land their lunar landers. So it was filmed, and there are pictures of the surface that was filmed for these simulators. They're big sections. These were taken from the lunar orbiter photographs. I'm not talking about the lunar reconnaissance orbiter, that comes much later. The lunar orbiter photographs provided the original material for the simulation to be created. That's what it was about. Nothing secret about any of that. None of the people who were doing it would have thought anything odd about creating a simulated environment to be filmed so that the astronauts could see what they would be looking at as they were landing or attempting to land their craft. That's what it was about. Whether they did land the craft or whether what we saw were film of the simulators, if you're going to do a simulation of let's say Apollo 11, that was 8 days from takeoff to landing. So the simulation would have been 8 days. So the crew at Houston, mission control at Houston, would have been on duty. They had to go through the whole simulated exercise. So they had a satellite launched. It was called the Tetra-A satellite, testing and training satellite, which was launched in order that they could be receiving signals as if from space, so that when they were looking at their consoles and they were checking through what was supposed to be happening, they would have what looked to them a real signal. They couldn't tell where the signal was coming from. All they're seeing is what's on their screen. But somebody had to create the signal to be sent to the satellite to be received back on at Houston so they could simulate the whole mission. It was done for all of the 7 missions in total. Apollo 13 we've already discussed. So a simulation took place, and it was filmed, and it was recorded, and astronauts would then be debriefed on it. This is quite normal. Nothing secret about any of it. There were people who would have been involved in creating it as the final definitive film of the landing, yes, but not many, probably about 40 or 50 at the most. The astronauts would certainly have been involved, because if they weren't actually on the moon, they had to persuade the public that they had been on the moon. And if anybody has ever seen the Apollo 11 press conference, where the 3 astronauts, Armstrong, Aldrin and Collins, sat in front of the world's press for an hour and a half answering questions, and the questions were very enthusiastic questions, they don't look particularly happy. In fact, they look embarrassed. They look almost as if they would rather be anywhere but there. These men who are supposed to be have created an epoch-defining event, first man to land on the moon. They look embarrassed. They look unhappy. Right, they were certainly trained astronauts. They might have been trained public speakers. But tough, that doesn't add up. They knew what they were going to let themselves in for. They knew what they were going to be doing. If they felt embarrassed about being questioned by the press, they should have simulated a press conference to get used to the idea. It's not rocket science that they weren't more enthusiastic about what they had achieved, because everybody around them was so enthusiastic about it. You'd think it would have reflected a little bit on how they behaved. Anyway, I think they went into low Earth orbit, stayed in low Earth orbit for as long as it was necessary for the length of time the mission was supposed to last, and then come back, re-enter. And don't forget, coming back from low Earth orbit is much easier than coming back from lunar orbit in terms of speed and danger involved, because nobody was looking out for them, because nobody expected them to be in low Earth orbit. And they're not that easy to see. I mean, satellites are not that easy to see. And anyway, they would just be the command module. It wouldn't be any more than that, because the huge rocket, the first section was jettisoned about 40 miles downrange. Second section was jettisoned in low Earth orbit, about 100 miles up. So it wouldn't be difficult to do it. And who would be looking out for them? Because they weren't expected to be in low Earth orbit. And unless you know where to look, you can see that the International Space Station, it's a huge thing. You can see that when it's at a particular point in the evening where the sun is low in the horizon, and it strikes the underside of the International Space Station. If you're in the right place, you know where to look and you know what time to look, you can see it. So if they went into low Earth orbit, did a bit of discussion between Houston, who were also expecting them to be on their way to the moon, so they knew what the script was supposed to be. And if you look at any of the Apollo press packs, which are several hundred pages long, they detail everything that happens to the nearest second, from launch to splashdown, is detailed in advance to the nearest second. So they knew what they had to say. They knew what they were supposed to be doing. And my contention would be that Apollo 13 was scripted in advance, because it encouraged because after the disaster of Apollo 12, where there was no television picture, so there was nothing for anybody to watch, they had to get the interest up again. So that's what happened in Apollo 13. And then you get on to Apollo 15, where they take the little buggy onto the moon. And if you look at some of the film of that, there's some very strange effects created by this buggy. Right, so yeah, answer to the question, they went into low Earth orbit, stayed there for as long as they had to for the mission, came back down again, as we saw. There are photographs actually showing an Apollo command module being shoved out the back of a Galaxy 130. So it could be they weren't even on the rocket in the first place. Because if that rocket had exploded on the launch pad, they would have to have been killed. Now, if they weren't on the rocket and the rocket exploded, we've got the scenario depicted rather graphically in the film Capricorn 1. And I do wonder if film Capricorn 1 was based on certain information which was known to certain individuals around the film business. And they made a film about it. It's happened so often in the past that Hollywood has put forward stories that are of benefit to the intelligence services. The two industries, intelligence services and Hollywood, work closely together. And certainly it's now coming out that the amount of cooperation between the US government, Hollywood and the intelligence services. You've heard of Operation Mockingbird? That's how it's done. And it's still being done today. It never stopped, which is why we see such appallingly distorted news. It's been written not by the reporters who are investigating it, but by people who are trying to foment an agenda. The vacuum isn't relevant to the operation of a rocket. The rocket produces a thrust against itself. That's how they work. I mean, being in a vacuum is irrelevant, in my view. Jet engines can't work in a vacuum. Propeller-driven aircraft can't work in a vacuum, but rockets can, because it provides its own thrust.
So is NASA still hoaxing events of today's plans to get back to the moon?
No, I think that NASA have got a major problem on their hands now. They have to do it for real, because enough people are watching and checking out what they're doing in considerable detail because of the access to the internet and YouTube and all the people who are space enthusiasts. I mean, I consider myself a space enthusiast, but we want NASA to be honest. I would love them to succeed. I would love them to go back to the moon, photograph the Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17 landing sites and say, look, we got it the first time, look, here are the pictures. You can prove that we did it the first time. I'd love that. I'd love that to happen. And if it does happen, I'll shut up and go away and do something else. But until they do that and provide definitive evidence, and please don't quote the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs showing the landing sites allegedly on the lunar surface. Forget it. They're photoshopped. And you can prove it. Look at your own house on Google Maps, preferably one taken with an orbiting satellite. And I've looked at one. It's called the GOI-1 satellite. It orbits 640 kilometers above the Earth, 400 odd miles, filming through the Earth's atmosphere and distortion. And you can see individual cars on the road. You can see if it's got a sunroof, so you know which way the car's pointing. You look at your own house, you can recognize the features of it. Those Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter photographs were taken using similar equipment, defining 0.4 meters per pixel, and you can't see a damn thing, except a few blobs. But we want NASA to be honest, and now they have to be. Have to be. Have to be. Have to be. Have to be.